Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Great. Good to be here with you at GBF. I've been a member for a long time. I always intend to come more often, and then it's Sunday morning and the alarm clock goes off and the New York Times is there and the coffee is there. And my deep devotion to practice and meditation says I'm going to do more meditation later. But it's good to be here today, and particularly good to be here in the sort of confusing and complicated times we're living in, and particularly here at GBF where we have the opportunity to remember and appreciate and love Jeff Lindemood, who is the president of GBF and who most of us love and cared about deeply, and he touched our hearts in ways that are hard to describe. So when I was thinking about coming to think about Jeff, I looked at his website, and here's what he says about himself. Jeff describes his approach and values as a healer and a therapist. Through deep listening and presence, I connect with you in a way that is about awareness and wholeness, as well as the conflicted, unclear, and unattended places calling for our attention. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I had a few occasions over the years where he and I would get together and talk, and he just knew the right thing to say. And I'd like to tell you that it was something profound and earth-moving, and it was the way it turned out. But often it was, as you will recall, the laugh or the, shall we say, sly aside about whoever it was that was causing me troubles. And so we were able to, and I used to make a lot more sly asides than I make these days when I'm practicing. But you know, when I heard that Jeff had passed away, I took out a video that I had that he had told me about. And first thing you noticed in the video is that gentle, calming voice that was present also, as well as other voices. But he said that his life came with a curriculum. And he said life is about coming and going, about learning and failing, about invitations and opportunities to live, and to live a contemplative life. And the curriculum was simply that, to look at everything that your life is and has been and say, what can I learn from this? And for somebody who's practiced for 40 years, as Jeff did, what can I teach? And knowing that as a Buddha, each of us as a Buddha, even if you haven't yet decided that that's who you are, take my word for it, we are all Buddhas because that's what the Buddha said. And it becomes, Jeff said, a platform for our practice. The way we live, the way we walk, the way we talk, the way we hold others, the way we allow ourselves to be held, so that those who need to do some holding have someone to do that. So I just say this morning, thank you, Jeff, for that teaching and for the many ways that you touched my life and our individual lives in this room and the life of the Sangha and the life of all the people that you encountered. Most of you know that back in the most dark days of the HIV epidemic, Jeff was working at the hospital and doing the hard work of helping people acknowledge and accept their illness and know that there wasn't much hope. And yet he did that work that helped people to stand in a place that said, I accept that this is part of it. And then the daily things he said and done over the years for all of us, and including here in the Sangha. I'm sure I was never at one of your board meetings, but I'm sure that the board meetings were all dreadfully serious, with no opportunities for wit and wisdom. And I'm sure that when those moments got tight, that I know many of you on the board, but Jeff for sure was able to keep things moving and keep this beautiful Sangha operating for 25 years. How long have you been around?
Long time.
A long time.
Yeah.
Longer than 25.
Very young.
I'm much too young to know the answer to that then. And so when we think of death, particularly of a dear friend, an important, impactful person. One of the things that we do as human beings is we begin to tell stories. And often our first stories are about how unfair death is at this age for the person. How could that happen? We weren't expecting it, or we weren't expecting it so soon, or in the way that it actually happened. And so our first stories are about that. And then we often turn to stories that are concerns about us. If this could happen to that person, then what should I be concerned about? When might it happen to me or somebody who I depend on in life and really count on to be there for me and is an important part of the structure of my life? When might that happen? And then when you hear about a death, you think, I wonder what are the health concerns that I should be paying attention to, diseases that I've never heard of, and things that can come into my life. And so we begin to tell these stories. And as we know, we talk frequently in Sanghas, this one and others, about that our lives are made up of stories, as I say. At good times and in challenging times, we tell stories. We as human beings are meaning makers, and we need to know if you walk outside and somebody drives by and flips you the bird, the first thing is that's rude and awful. I was standing on the corner. I wasn't going to walk in front of your car. And the second thing is, why did they do that to me? Why does this happen to me? And, we begin to tell those kind of stories. Rebecca Solnit, a teacher, says, we are fed and freed by the good stories and trapped and damaged by the bad ones. And by the people who believe those stories, and sometimes the people that believe those negative stories are us, right? We were all raised in families and communities and countries and societies that taught us some stories about who we are, particularly here in the Gay Buddhist Fellowship. We grew up, many of us, there are some wonderful young people in the room, but then there's the rest of us, and we grew up in times that were absolutely as unwelcoming then as times are becoming again. And so we made up stories to figure out how to survive. And some of those stories were who we are, what personas we could present, how we're going to live. And in that video that I referred to of Jeff's, he said that life becomes practice. We can make decisions about what stories we take in. This is Jeff. What stories we tell, where we choose to be silent because the pain and confusion and sadness are just too great. And in those moments, silence itself becomes a story. So we are indeed living in challenging times, right? The current regime that's running this country, the tragedy of its war on innocent immigrant families, particularly in a country where almost every family has an immigration story. Almost every family in the country. We were all bolted into awareness the last couple weeks and hopefully action by the murders of Nicole Good and Alex Preddy. And for many of us, our first awareness at that time when we began to look more closely, if we had ignored or not been paying much attention, or as much attention as we should, to what ICE was doing, we were bolted into the awareness that 35 people have died in ICE custody, 8 of whom were shot in the last 12 months. And that what's going on, if Alex and Nicole's deaths can motivate us to action, motivate us to kindness, we can respond to this news in a way that is a true tribute to those two people. And the story we tell can be a different story than simply being horrified or shut down or overwhelmed, which is a reasonable response to that. And then we take it a step back further than just the 35 folks and realize that the regime in this country has been torturing and damaging families and individuals and elders, and even arresting a 5-year-old last week for the whole time it's been in office. And so when we expand our hearts as we do with metta practice and send love and compassion and service out further and further, it's time for all of us to remember that because we may not have been aware, and I'm not speaking, maybe all of you have been very much aware and very active and very responsive, and I thank you for that. But I'm guessing that there's more that we can do. And so how can we respond to things that seem overwhelming and things that seem to be so much of a burden? I've had some health issues this year involving pulmonary and other stuff, and people have said to me recently, we can't hear you when you talk. and I've always been sort of loud and boisterous, and so I listened to a video at a talk at a song I did, and in fact, I'm beginning to sound like Rula Linska. So if anybody back there in the back can't hear, just let me know, because my voice actually, his voice box has undergone some changes that the doctors say nothing they can do about it. So anyway, so what can we do in terms of the overwhelm in the world? Last Tuesday was International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and that's a day when everybody in the world is asked to stop and to be alert to the potential and reality of that great human tragedy. So I turned out a documentary that morning and was deeply moved by a couple things. First, it was a photojournalism, pictures of folks in the camps in Auschwitz and other camps in Europe, and stark but beautiful pictures, but stunning and devastating and so forth. And the voiceover was a woman speaking, and what she was saying was, how in the world did people not respond? These pictures were taken, were published, and were on all the news medias all across the world. So how has the world stood by and didn't respond to those photographs? And it's a good question, right? And yet the response in Germany and in other countries in Europe and around the globe was inadequate for what was going on. So the second thing that happened was that the same woman came on screen, and she was what is referred to as the righteous among the nations. She was a person who had, during that time, she was not a Jewish person, but she was a person who had recognized the risk that folks were living with and had risked her own safety and life rescuing Jewish folks from being arrested and taken off to the camps. And so what she talked about with the reporter was that she agreed that we should never forget the horror of what the leader of that movement did, and never forget he and his commanders and so forth, what they did. But that what they would like to do on that day of remembrance is two things. One, remember the victims and the families, those who courageously went on from there, having lost family members, having lost whole communities, having lost whole faith communities, synagogues, and somehow managed to find the strength to move on. And then to really spend some time thinking about the people who didn't see those pictures and sit quietly by, but saw those pictures and thought, this is huge and overwhelming, what can I do? If we can't save everybody, maybe I can save somebody. If we can't save the whole community, maybe I can do something that generates good to at least counterbalance the evil that's being generated in the world. And so I was really struck by the beauty of that. And because I didn't have my remote control in hand, the next thing that came on was the news. And so I normally, these days, would have shut it off on a Sunday morning, but the Tuesday morning. But the news segment was, of course, about Minneapolis and what's going on there. And this very earnest reporter came on, all out of breath, talking about ICE for 2 sentences, and then talked about the fact that their behavior was probably illegal and unconstitutional for a sentence, and then talked a little bit about who the people being recruited into ICE are, 2 sentences. And then they talked about the loving and compassionate nurse who had been murdered in cold blood on the street, 1 sentence. And then they went on to talk with a lot of gust and vigor about the President and the Secretary of Homeland Security. So the focus felt really out of balance to me, but it painted a picture for me of where, when we think about what we can do as compassionate, loving bodhisattvas or Buddhas, what we can do, which is to expand that story in all stories in context. The focus and balance can be changed. So I know we must be aware of and condemn the behavior of our political leaders right now. And I know that we must do everything we can to put a stop to what's going on with ICE and communities, immigrant communities, communities of color. I know that, and that's correct. But as I said a minute ago, the way to honor the 2 folks, Nicole and Alex, who died in the last couple of weeks, is by doing something positive. And everything in our Buddhist practice tells us that. Buddha said that it is possible to experience joy in the face of suffering, and that in fact without joy there is no suffering. Without suffering, there is no joy. Thich Nhat Hanh famously says, no mud, no lotus. And what that is a call to do is to expand. So we can stand still and be overwhelmed by the news and repeat the news. And some of you probably had occasions to be on text message chains or out to coffee with friends and other places and told stories about what was going on in Minneapolis and heard stories about what was going on in Minneapolis, assumed those stories to be true, and then went somewhere else and told them again. And you know, that's what we do as people. We live by stories. We live by stories. So perhaps as a Sangha and in our families and in our communities, even in the face of frustration and anger and grief and horror, we can choose to tell stories about love. One of those people murdered last week was a mom. Both were community activists. Alex was a nurse practitioner in the intensive care unit of a veterans hospital. Not work that, you know, I mean, it is work. I'll stay positive. It is work that really takes the commitment of heart and mind and spiritual practice, whatever his spiritual practice was. But our bodhisattva vows, for those of us who are in the Mahayana traditions, and our Buddha nature for all of us who are into practice, tell us that we should live and be lived for the benefit of all beings. Live and be lived for the benefit of all beings. And so we are invited to say, the world is getting darker and darker and darker, and we know that there's some other things going on that we could look at. So how do we, in the face of this grief, how do we turn our hearts to compassion and to wisdom and to connection so that grief is not the only thing that we're sharing? Fleet Ball, the Buddhist teacher that some of you have heard of, said the Buddhist prison project, he says, are we truly staying present and connected to the world around us, or have we become well-regulated spectators to the suffering we see? So well-regulated spectators. How many of us, and I said for quite a while, when the current regime was being re-elected or purchased the election or whatever they did, I said, I've stopped watching the news. I'm not going to do it. I'm not paying attention. It's too depressing. I'm going to stay out of it. And now I've had to ask myself the question and make some changes in that it's like, if we don't watch the news, if we aren't at least aware of the depths of the evil that's going on, if we're not aware of the grief that's being caused for us as people and communities and so forth, then we're not taking our responsibility fully. So for all of those who heard me over the last 2 years say, I don't watch the news and neither should you, I changed my mind. We should watch a little bit, and we should remember that there are stories on the news that are one of the few ways we can get the bigger picture, but that those stories are for sale. They're designed to ramp up emotions because emotions and anger and so forth sell news. So listen to what we're hearing with the knowledge that all news is subjective and most of the news we hear is for sale. So that's important. But I think the issue that we're really dealing with right now is grief. You know, the grief of living in, you know, if anybody had told you, any of us, no matter how young or old you are, if anybody had told you when you were taking high school or college physics, civics, or government class, that someday a president would rush into another country, kidnap the president and wife, and on the way out announce that he was the new acting president. And when he was asked by the news media why he did it, he said, because we need the oil reserves. We need those oil reserves. No, you know, I mean, we think leaders of countries have, for years, old men have gone to war for oil reserves and money, but the rest of them had the common sense not to say it out loud in a news conference. And so that's what he said. And then he threatened Greenland and Cuba and a couple other countries, and then got mad because people weren't giving him a Nobel Peace Prize after he had declared 5 wars in 1 week. If anybody had told us that could happen, we would have thought science fiction or, you know, Mel Brooks, or we would have thought something was going on, but that couldn't possibly be the case. But the fact is that what we're doing is grieving for a notion of what America could be, grieving of the notion of what we thought America was, you know, and so forth. And so how do we learn to deal with grief? What's the story that we have for that? And Joan Sutherland, a Buddhist teacher, says that she thinks it's not grief that's weakening us, but she thinks that it's all we do to avoid it. All we do to avoid grief, to distract ourselves, to ease the pain without really looking at the pain. And she says to think of it this way: grief is a Buddha. Not something to learn lessons from, but just the way it is sometimes. The spirit and the body in this season of your life, or in this season of the world. Grief is a Buddha, joy is a Buddha, anger is a Buddha, peace is a Buddha. And so everything is impermanent. And so we need to just say, when joy comes, most of us hang on to it. I have a few friends who, when joy comes, they use the expression, waiting for the other shoe to drop, but they're special friends. But for most people, when joy comes, we grab it and hold it tenderly and hopefully. And when love comes, we hold it hopefully, tenderly and joyfully. But when grief comes, or fear comes, or anger comes, for many of us, we tell stories that push it away. Not going to deal with that right now. But grief is a form of love. Grief says how we go on loving in the absence of somebody who we've lost, as we have here with Jeff's death, or as we have in our country with our sense of values and connection and decency. And so we deal with shock and sorrow and rage and regret, and we have all of those feelings, and they're real. Someone said, you've heard the expression, feelings aren't facts. Cute. But the feelings are ours, and they're real, and they're in us, and they guide us, and they set up the bumpers against which we don't want to bump. And so if fear is over here and anger is over here, we try to stay in here. If grief is here, we try to stay away from that wall. And so what's necessary is for us to see all of those things, joy and love and connection and commitment, as well as grief and anger and fear and resentment and so forth, and to find a way to live in the middle of that. Howard Zen was a professor at Boston University when I was there long time ago. And he's the author of The People's History of the World. And I want to just read you a little bit of what Howard said in his book. To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act, and at least the possibility of sending the spinning top of a world in a different direction. The possibility of sending the spinning top of a world in a different direction. And if we do act in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents. And to live now as we think human beings should live is defiance of all that is bad around us, and is itself a marvelous victory. Is itself a marvelous victory. So I think we're called, not just because of the kind of people each of you is, each of us is, to do little random acts of kindness, to do service, to be building connections, to be building systems of support and nurturing. I think we're not called just to do that, but we're called because there are great forces of darkness floating around out there, and we need to balance those forces with light. And so there's a new book by Norma Wong Roshi who says, Who We Are Becoming Matters. And I just saw some of the pages from it. It's coming out soon. But she gave a talk, a Zoom talk, and there were some pages available. And what she says is, she invites us to a commitment to the right to participate and in turn to be taken care of. If you participate, you have the right to be taken care of. It's not just a task, but a sacred binding connection that shapes one's purpose and one's actions, accompanying personal accountability, cultural practices, and stewardship. So again, I think all of our Buddhist practice, all of our basic decent humanity says, when we take a look at what's going on in the world, whether it's the death in the family or friend or in our Sangha, or there are tragic things and horrible things that are happening in the world, we have a right to grieve. It's important that we grieve and that we feel that loss, and we feel the loss and recognize the stories that we start to tell, because that's what we do. As humans, that's what we do. And we figure out which of those stories we want to keep. You all remember the teaching of the Buddha when he said, do not believe everything you hear, even if you heard it from me. Take it and try it and keep only those things that are a benefit to you and benefit to you as you provide service to others, as you care for others. Keep only those things. So that was an early teaching about these stories. So we hear stories, and the Buddhism, the sutras and so forth are wonderful examples, because the Buddha taught on the side of a mountain with theoretically 30,000 people present, and some people heard it, and they decided to write it down, and you all know the story, right? 500 years later, they had a meeting, 500 years later, and all those stories that had been passed from one to the other were at that meeting, and a large assembly of people decided to group edit the stories from the Buddha. And so they're the perfect example of there's a message there. There's a message there, but if we get tied up in the specifics or tied up in the interpretations and so forth, that can be really a problem for us. So today, as we sit together, as we talk together in a few minutes, and as we go out into the world together, I think we have a real opportunity to say, there's some stories that help me deal with the pain of a loss, the pain of a death. There are some stories that will help me and embolden me and force me to be engaged in what's going on in our various communities and our country and the world. And those are all important stories. And how do I sort out the ones that are real and painful, but I have to go through them and live them? And then how do I bring in the stories that are beautiful and compassionate and caring, like the righteous folks who stood up during the Holocaust, like the folks, Alex and Nicole, who were out doing activist work, two white folks out doing activist work to protect immigrants in Minneapolis when they met their demise. How do we engage stories that say, wow, those were two beautiful, dynamic, fabulous human beings, and they're gone, and their actions are a call to us to figure out what we can do about it. Roshi Joan Halifax from the Upaya Zen Center said that in Buddhism, we get this wonderful thing. Our Buddhist practice doesn't just give us better stories, although we get some of those. What we get is the ability to pause our stories. For 30 minutes today, I don't know how many, there may be 40 of us here all together between here and there. So for 30 minutes today, we paused our stories. Because of course everyone was completely focused and no one had thoughts going on in their mind. But to some degree, we paused our storytelling mechanism. We paused our interpretation mechanism. We paused our editing mechanism. We paused our check out the sources and what can I believe and what can't I believe. So for 30 minutes, we paused our stories. We quiet down and we sit without noise. And she says that we sit without the noise, whether it's a lullaby or a loud howl. And we sit with the stories that we tell ourselves, and we maybe glimpse things as they are without the overlay of interpretation or projection. So the task before us, I think, is to say, how do we equip ourselves for the journey ahead? And many people pack for journeys, to get ready to go with everything. And a different process is maybe to unpack some things. Unpack our resistance to action, unpack our sense of overwhelm that we can't do anything, unpack any of you have woken up since that person was elected a year ago and thought, couldn't get any worse, this is awful, I've never seen anything like it, only to wake up 2 days later and say, it got worse, how did that happen? And so we have that opportunity. And one of the practices that we have that's a real tool for us in Buddhism is the metta practice, where we bring forth love and compassion and care. And metta or loving kindness practice, it starts with us, and then we go to the people who are most important to us and dear to us, like our sangha, our families, and then we go to people who are sort of neutral, and then we go to people who are difficult. But the important thing that a lot of us miss, like just for show of hands, how many of you have a metta or loving kindness practice a little bit of some kind? Yeah. And how many of you, when you start out saying, I am a beautiful human being and I am deserving and worthy of love? Yeah. So maybe you do and you just don't say it in those words. But next time you decide to sit and do your metta practice, start with that. I am a beautiful human being, deserving and worthy of love because I give service and I give love and I'm worthy of love. And I think that one of the things in metta practice that we sometimes forget is that it starts there. And if it doesn't start there, then I'm sitting like a noisy gong in this chair saying, having a bad day, whatever else is going on. Oh, but I'll do metta practice. Okay, so I'm going to send love to you too. And then we're going to send love to that next row. And it's like, but I don't have any love because I'm feeling angry and hurt and frustrated. So the first thing is to say, I'm a lovable person who's having some emotions and I need to build connections and I need to, provide service and so forth. So that's one of the beautiful tools. Metta practice or loving kindness practice is just absolutely gorgeous. But I invite you and suggest that you start out by taking just a moment at the beginning of your metta practice to say, if I'm going to send love to those I love, to those who are close to me, to those who are distant from me, and to those who are troublesome to me, it needs to come from a place of love. And you are places of love. You are people of love and service and kindness. And sometimes in this day-to-day hectic world we live in, it just takes a moment to remind ourselves of that, to own that and to feel good about it. On that webpage that I mentioned that I looked at for Jeff, our president, he said this: what would it be like to live with more agency and authenticity and meaning while reaching some of your goals? Here's what he said that was so important. The world needs what only you can offer. The world needs what only you can offer, so recognize that coming from yourself. What each of us is longing for is the best version of ourselves, which is a version that is connected, loved, lovable, and seen. So that's Jeff. Even though he's not here this week, he still had that beautiful message for us. So I think bringing loving awareness to the places in our lives that are tender, that are hurting, that are devastated, that are overwhelmed, is exactly what the medicine is, right? And what's beautiful about a Sangha and friends is that when you don't have it, and there are days recently when I have not had it, between my health stuff and other stuff that's going on and the loss of three people in the last week to death, and my having some health stuff in a certain age, so it's like, oops, is there a line forming to the left for people to check out? So all that stuff going on. So you have days, I have days, I imagine you do too, where it's just like, I can't do it today. And for me, as some of you know from times I've been here before, I go to Ocean Beach and walk up and down along the beach, listen to the waves crash, 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 hit the shore, and become gentle water on the way back out. And that's all the spirituality I need on some of those days. Or I call a friend to go for that walk or to have a talk or whatever. But I recognize that some days I just really need the support. So today, as we talk to each other in the discussion section, which will begin in just a second, and when we leave the Sangha, the safe place, let's remember Jeff, our president, and his life of practice, learning, and teaching. And let's tell those stories of practice, loving, and teaching, and great sense of humor and good stories. And many of you traveled with him, and I know some of you had the great privilege and honor to be with him as he transitioned to the Great Mystery. Let's also tell the stories of Nicole and Alex, and tell the stories not just of the tragic murder. We don't want to forget that at all or minimize that, but we also want to tell the story of two beautiful human beings who are out doing service, willing to take those kind of risks. So we don't want to forget the horror, but we want to talk about community and connection and love and a willingness to get out there. And we don't have to feel like we have to drive to Minneapolis and do things. We can do the little things that we talk about here all the time, the little ways of connecting and loving and providing service at a Sangha like this one. Thanks to all those of you who put this together. But you as an individual decide what stories you're going to hold. You decide what stories you're going to tell. You decide what stories you're going to interpret. and you decide which stories will add joy and beauty to the world rather than a continuous focus on the dark and unseemly. As human beings and as bodhisattvas and Buddhas, it's my belief we can't hold all that pain, nothing but pain. And so that is, the Buddha said it is not wrong to experience joy in a world with suffering and conflict. It is not wrong. It is in fact imperative that we find some context and some balance for that, for those larger pieces. So I want to close what I have to say by just reading a short poem as a tribute to Jeff and as a tribute to all of you as you figure out how we work in this world. And this is by a poet named Tierney. She says, "To belong is to know your place in the forest, not as a solitary trunk standing against the wind, but as a part of something ancient and ongoing, roots intertwined beneath the soil where no one can see. The branches reach upward, outward, towards light, each one a story, a generation, a dream carried forward. We are the fruit of those who came before, sweet with their wisdom and shaped by their seasons. The roots run deep, drinking from shared waters, holding memories of storms weathered together, of droughts survived by drawing from collective strength. They whisper, 'You are held. You have always been held.' Collective healing is the sap that flows between us. What nourishes one nourishes all. What wounds one sends tremors through the network. When we tend to our own healing, the whole tree strengthens. To connect with the branches and the roots is to remember we are neither the first nor the last. We are the living bridge between what was and what will be, bearing both the scars and the blossoms of our lineage. Here, in this connection, we find our truest selves, not isolated, but interwoven, not alone, but belonging to something far greater than any single life." Thank you, Tierney. Thank you, Jeff. Thank all of you.
Any comments?
Questions, comments, thoughts? Yes.
Thank you so much. You mentioned a lot of things that we could be doing, should be doing, would be nice to do. I would like to add one thing, and that is to forgive ourselves when we don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Forgiveness practice is so crucial. Oftentimes we find once we start a forgiveness practice that we don't actually have anything to forgive, but we're holding it. It's a story. We're holding it. I said to somebody, I was at a Sangha meeting on Friday, there's this person there who had been giving me these horrible looks for the last couple of times I saw him. And so I took him aside courageously and said, "I'd really like to apologize for whatever I did to cause you to be so uncomfortable, to have these feelings." He said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I have," and he used this expression, "please forgive me, resting something face." And he said, I really am not offended. You haven't hurt me in any possible way. And, kind of get over yourself is what he said. But it was the forgiveness practice was me first saying, I have to take responsibility if I hurt this man's feelings, and I have to apologize for it and make what we call in recovery an amends, which is not just an apology, but to change an amend, to amend the behavior, change the behavior. And a forgiveness practice is really important internally and to the person hurt or offended. And then sometimes you get a nice reminder that we have created, if some of you are old enough to remember Melanie Safka, a folk singer back in the 60s, probably there's maybe one or two of you in the room, but she had a song that said, I built and climbed a mountain, it just wasn't there. I built and climbed a mountain, it just wasn't there. Yeah. So, but forgiveness is really important. Thank you for adding that.
Thank you. It's always been such a gift. And thank you for speaking about Jeff. I dreamt about him twice this week, and I just can't get around it. But I had dinner with a friend whose oldest son was killed in a car accident, and I was dreading seeing her because I felt completely unable to fully respond. But right away, she was herself, and she said, I talk to him all the time. And it was, she didn't have to say, maybe I'm avoiding the grief. I mean, she had unspeakable grief, but she was all advice. She just continues the open bond, which I love that about her. But I heard a woman, I don't know where, who was terrified of flying after 9/11. And she was in an airport, afraid to fly, and she saw a pilot, and she went up and said, how do you have the nerve and the courage to continue to fly planes? And he put his arms on her shoulders, and he looked right at her and said, ma'am, most people are good. And she said it changed her life. It changed how she raised her children. It's so penetrated. And I think I have friends from Minneapolis and Minnesota, and they say, they say we're nice, but we're really tough. We just start with nice. Don't mess with us. And they're so deeply proud of the lesson of patriotic resistance that they're showing Americans. Anyway,
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, they walk around for 4 months a year when it's below zero, so they're pretty tough folks. Yes.
Thank you, Stephen. I like this idea of looking at what drives our stories. Because when I see the news and people are like, oh my God, how can this be happening? They're like all aghast. And I think to myself, well, how can it be any other way? Like, this has gone on through history, and then especially here in this country, which was built on colonialism and genocide and slavery and, violence and greed. It's not like this is new. And I like to remind myself, like, how can it be any other way? It's baked in. So it's no wonder it bubbles to the surface every now and then. I think it's just so audacious, the way it's happening now. I think that's what surprises people. And so it's good to remind ourselves. I like the way you brought it back to, like, what's in me? How can I, do some self-soothing to prepare myself? And then how can I use that as an example, spread that out? And that's what Buddhism does for me. It brings me down to how can we set an example? How can I change myself? And then how can I be, using that out in the world to spread compassion and something better? Because during the last administration, the one before the Obama administration, there was this hope of this trajectory, like, oh, we're on a new path, Not so much. So make sure I don't get caught up in a story of like, oh, the way things used to be, Be real about it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody on Zoom?
What else? Anybody on Zoom?
Well, then it might be time for cookies. Oh, yes.
I'll speak up. Two things. You're talking about grief and also bringing up the idea of stories. After the last election, and I was just sitting here thinking, I can't believe this has just been not even a year. It seems like much longer. But my reaction when I woke up that morning with the results, I just went through a range of emotions: anger, humiliation, mortification, fear. And after about a week, I realized, there's this other feeling that I'm feeling, and I think I recognize it, and it took me a while to realize, oh my God, I feel grief. And that's when I started to look at my stories. The first big story was like my story of what I think America is, and what direction it's going in. And after I started to kind of look at that and get more clear about that it's a story and not necessarily accurate, then I just started identifying all the other stories I tell myself to give myself a sense of security. And so that's really been my practice for the past year. You know, popping a lot of little bubbles. I've already mentioned this in the song previously, but got some great guidance with Pema children. When things fall apart and the places that scare you. Definitely dealing with that, you know, feeling comfortable with groundlessness and uncertainty. And so, yeah, brought that all up. But yeah, it's been very much these stories that I tell myself. It's been very much on my mind.
Yeah. And they can be survival mechanisms briefly, and then they become distractions, and then they become extra weight. So it's good to recognize them that way. Anybody else have a thought, question? Yes.
I just appreciated, I heard you often use the word service. I just want to just bring that back in the room, because I appreciate that notion of this sort of about being about someone else, about being service to, and it's that sense of service, generosity.
Yeah. Interconnection. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for your talk, and I recently heard somebody talk about being real, you know, what that meant to them, and I guess before my Buddhist practice and my recovery, I did not realize how many emotions could exist at one time, and for me, I use my substance to get rid of all those emotions and feel in control, which was an illusion. And today, through many years of recovery and practice, I realized that to be real is kind of messy sometimes. And I like neat packages. I like, you know, to have it, you know, put the bow on and present a certain thing. And life has definitely gotten a bit messy at times lately, messier than usual, and to fight it is so exhausting. To think I could change it is just like, acceptance is the answer. And then once one accepts, I say all emotions welcome, what else is possible? And if I wake up on the wrong side of the bed, I woke up on the wrong side of the bed. And as you mentioned, I could either stay there, turn on Netflix, or I could reach out to someone who knows me and that I trust and say, you know what, I'm on that wrong side of the bed. Or I could go to the beach, I could watch a wave, I'd hummingbirds make nests in my yard this year. It was the most spiritual thing I've seen in a long time. And in 3 weeks, they're out of the nest and flying. They were just this little geek. So I guess there's wonder. I want to live in wonder, and I also wonder how. And I guess it's just to be fully into it as much as I can, whatever it is on a given moment. And I no longer am scared when I'm falling apart, quote unquote. I'm just not where I'd like to be, but I am there. So anyway, and I heard a lot of that in your share and seeing how you live your life too. So thank you.
Speaking of retreats, the registration is open for our retreat at Vajrapani, April 15th and 19th. Sean Oakes will be our teacher. And it's open to all queer people, whoever you choose to identify. So we have in the past limited to cisgendered males. I'm really happy we're opening it up. If you're queer, you can be there.
And we'll gather in a circle for the dedication of that. By the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow. And may all live with equanimity without too much attachment or too much aversion, believing in the equality of all that live.